Well, as always, it's a great pleasure to welcome everyone to one of our seminars in the series Topics in the Aesthetics of Music and Sound. And today we have a very special guest who's with us for the first time, Sellars, who's going to be talking to us about Shostakovich. But before we begin, we'll do as we always do. I ask everyone who's present, is it in order that your image and audio eventually appears on YouTube? And so I have consent from everyone in the room. That should make our lawyers happy here at the University of Southern Denmark. And then we usually have a short round of introductions so we all know who is here. So my name is Cynthia Grund. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Southern Denmark, and I have the pleasure of being the research leader for the project, The Performances of Everyday Living, and this is the sort of context in which this seminar series is taking place during this semester and the coming semesters. Johnny, would you like to?
Yeah, my name is Johnny Harboe. I'm a master in comparative literature here from University of Southern Denmark. Yeah, and I'm interested in music, all kinds of it. So I'm looking very much forward to this lecture.
Good.
Yes, hello. My name is Vitus Vestergaard, and I'm an assistant professor of media studies here at the University of Southern Denmark. And I've always had an interest in sound media and in music, and I have to leave a little bit early today because I'm actually also giving a small talk in another place about the visual side of heavy metal music. So it's a little bit different, but also it's a little bit related.
It's one of our pet projects this semester.
Yes.
Music.
So I'll be leaving a little bit.
Well, that's okay. That's a good excuse. Okay.
I'm Jarl, and I'm a master in philosophy, and I'm interested in ontology.
Yes, very good. As we usually say, Jarl is our resident and ontologist. Never hold a seminar without one. Yes, Thomas.
My name is Thomas, and I'm a music and metal fan.
Okay, good to have you here, Thomas. Claudio.
I'm Claudio Cifuentes-Alunate. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Cultural Studies. And I work with applied semiotic to the literature and the cultural phenomenon in general. And I have researched a little bit about the sublime in the music and the architecture and literature.
Yes, Claudio is our resident expert on the sublime. Yes. Good to have you here, Claudio. Evelyn.
My name is Evelyn. I'm a first-year student at the MA in Middle East Studies here at SDU, and I'm generally very interested in music, particularly in metal, but I'm open to any genre of music.
I'm Måns Davidson, Associate Professor in Literature at this place. I am interested in cross aesthetics, primarily in the formal resemblances between music, literature and pictorial art, working to develop a theory of correlativity.
Yes, our resident correlativist. Wonderful to have you here. And last but by no means least, with us on Skype, we have Bill Westney from Texas.
Yes, I am William Westney on the faculty of Texas Tech University. I'm a concert pianist and professor and former guest professorial fellow at SDU, and interested in all things that relate music and philosophy, especially as it relates to music and performance.
Yes, and Bill, of course, is an expert in the entire classical canon, and really it's something marvelously daring in November, and gave a talk about classical music and metal, which is gaining quite a few viewers on YouTube. I don't know if you've checked recently, Bill. But,
I know, but with your urging, I'll go back.
Yes, it's a hit. It's a hit. Okay, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the day, Sellars, who is a fellow associate professor here at the University of Southern Denmark, although within the English department, yes? And it's your first time speaking with us here. You've been abroad for a long time. It's good to have you back. And you're going to be talking about Shostakovich, irony, and you. Yes, so the floor is yours.
Or me.
Yes.
I'm aiming to talk, including all the music, for around 45 minutes, but this is quite approximate, and please let me know if you'd like me to abbreviate and skip bits. That's absolutely fine. Thanks. It's all quite flexible. I'm starting with Gustav Mahler, by way of introduction.
1 second before, I think we need some more volume on your computer.
Yeah, I think that was on its maximum, wasn't it? And this is as well.
Is this on its,
Yeah, yes.
do you think this is on its maximum volume?
It was a quiet excerpt.
Yeah.
It's piano. Nice track.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay, as long as, we'll see how the next one
Yeah, I mean,
works
some
out.
of it, some of what I'm going to play should be deafeningly loud.
Oh,
It should just blow you off your chairs.
okay. Well, we'll see
It
how.
probably won't, but you'll just have to imagine it.
Okay,
I'll
let's,
give you a signal. Okay, this is loud. And then,
well, let's start afresh and see if we can.
yeah, it is a quiet opening. So I'm starting with Gustav Mahler, as played by the Concertgebouw Orchestra of Amsterdam, conducted by Willem Mengelberg in 1939. Mengelberg had heard Mahler himself rehearse and perform the piece with the same orchestra. And I will remain with Mahler in what follows, even when his name is not mentioned. While my permanent attachment is indeed to SDU, the department in which I first worked here, that is English in Colling, no longer exists. And I'm now on 90% leave. So to cut a long story short, I'm both inside and outside, both immanent and transcendent in relation to SDU. And this being inside and outside is part of what I'd like to talk about today. Not that this presentation is about me, it's about Shostakovich and irony, and me in parentheses. What, you might ask, are my qualifications for talking to you about Shostakovich? None, except for 4 decades of listening to and attempting to play, or playing and attempting to listen to Shostakovich. I have no musicological qualifications as such, and little or no Russian. I'm an amateur, which is valid, but perhaps at the same time, to some extent, good. What, you might ask, are my qualifications for talking to you about irony? This question is itself ironic and unanswerable to the extent that it falls back on itself. The more irony, a priori, the less knowledge. That leaves me as a leftover. I will be arguing, in fact, that I, as listening subject, am a leftover in relation to the music of Shostakovich. In contrast to him, I can write anything I like, as long as it comes to play its role in feeding the positive system of university performativity analysed by Jean-François Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition, 1979. What I'm presenting today is work in progress, and is in a sense
even a feasibility study? But should it really even become a work at all? Given that my amateur leftover status is the basis for what I'm saying, and the amateur who works forfeits the name. Shostakovich is outside me, but also inside me. Another inside and outside structure. What I'd most like to do today is to find out where his music stands in relation to you. So what I'd like to do next is to play the Fourth Symphony of Shostakovich in its entirety, so that we can then discuss it together. That was, in fact, my original idea for this talk, but then I lost my nerve and I decided to talk instead. There's a double bind here. If I play the complete recording, which lasts about an hour, not only would there be no time for my talk, but we would most likely be too overwhelmed or puzzled by the symphony to be able to discuss it. At the same time, if I play only excerpts, the effect of the whole cannot be conveyed, and the excerpts themselves lose much, if not most, of their musical force. The solution to this double bind is manifold. Firstly, I must request that you all listen to the complete symphony, since if you don't, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and for the rest of your life. Secondly, I note the obvious fact that, as with any great work, there is no totality of response or interpretation in relation to it in any case. Totality is one of my aims today only in a negative sense. Thirdly, and most crucially, while the symphony is highly structured, it consists of fragments that do not add up to a whole in the first place. Instead of a whole, there are holes. And silence, as in the silent difference between whole and whole, plays an extremely important and underappreciated role in Shostakovich. To adapt the words of Wallace Stevens in The Creations of Sound, music, quote, is not dirty silence clarified. It is silence made still dirtier. The music of Shostakovich is dirty in just this sense. So it is a vital precondition for listening to Shostakovich that we do not automatically associate sound with positivity and silence with negativity, since such a commonplace association, or its direct inversion, would disable the dirty dialectic on which Shostakovich's music thrives, insofar as it ever does thrive. Shostakovich once asked his close friend Rostropovich to come round to see him, as the latter recounts in the documentary Rostropovich, the Genius of the Cello, which is on YouTube if you care to watch it, and this particular story is told from minutes 40 to 42 of that documentary. When Rostropovich arrives, Shostakovich asks him to sit down and not to speak. Olga, Rostropovich's daughter, then confirms that this happened more than once, the silent meetings lasting up to an hour and a half. Rostropovich confesses that for him, not speaking for 2 minutes feels like half a lifetime. But he recounts what Shostakovich said to him at the end of one such meeting. And I wish I could do a Russian accent, but I can't. Slava, thank you very much. That now, it's easier coming life for me. Thank you, bye-bye. That's Shostakovich as quoted in English by Rostropovich. To appreciate Shostakovich, one has to be able to endure silence, as Shostakovich did. I emphasize dissonance in my approach, beginning with the recognition that dissonance in Shostakovich does not lie only in what is heard, but also in a characteristic tension between what is heard and what cannot be heard. To take an obvious example, there is a series of chords in the lead-up to the recapitulation in the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, arising out of nothing, at first barely audible, each chord gradually becoming louder and more dissonant than the preceding one, until, with an inexorable appearance of logic, a chord is blasted out by this massive full orchestra containing all 12 tones. A totality that threatens to end all. But the series is punctuated by long moments of silence lasting 2 or 2.5 beats, which are at least as unsettling as the chords themselves. Thanks. So this is the moment that I'm talking about. Now, in the first movement of the symphony, and it's part of this very elaborate transition towards recapitulation. And the bit that I'm interested in and you're about to hear starts here, which is completely inaudible, and goes up to here, which is one of those moments that should blast you off your chairs, but won't. So you have to imagine that. The Concertgebouw Orchestra, again conducted this time by Kirill Kondrashin, who gave the first performance of the work. Well, I promised dissonance, and I hope that perhaps the final chord there may even count as metal. Can you tell me? Structural anticipation, as so often in this work, is blended with trepidation, anxiety, even terror. And when the recapitulation eventually arrives, as we will hear, it brings with it not fulfillment, but rather anticlimax and even collapse. Affirmation and subversion in Shostakovich I frequently found together in a kind of counterpoint. Further claim is implicit there, namely that Shostakovich's music is already a kind of thinking, making philosophy audible in musical terms. This is one reason why it's so urgent to listen, and this is what has been overheard in the search for something beneath or between the notes that would allow us then to categorize them. Early approaches to the question of Shostakovich and irony were heavily influenced by the so-called memoirs known as testimony in English, which are supposed to have been edited by Solomon Volkov, and which to a considerable extent are now discredited. But these approaches tended to cast Shostakovich as a dissident or an internal exile in the Soviet Union, fixing and solidifying the vital notion of negative freedom, such that Shostakovich was only free to negate, but was also bound to negate all the time in everything he wrote. Little wonder that he appears at the end of testimony as a sad sack. Volkov's approach is developed and amplified by Ian MacDonald in another well-known book, The New Shostakovich, which applies this throughout Shostakovich's music, such that despite appearances, dissidence is what the music really means every time. And as Christopher Norris and others pointed out quite early on, this is very predictable. For others, including, I'm sorry to say, Theodor Adorno, Shostakovich is a party hack, a conformist, turning the Volkov image on its head. A much more sophisticated analytical approach is found in S.T. Scheinberg's book, Irony, Satire, Parody and the Grotesque, in the music of Shostakovich. Her brilliant work is hampered by focusing too much on meaning and by a residual influence of the binary oppositions that I just sketched between appearance and reality. Irony is often organised, if not mastered, in terms of subjectivity. That would bring me to Hegel if I had time to talk about Hegel, but I'm going to skip Hegel, noting that Hegel didn't like irony, which is important. But for me, it's not a question of the musical expression of a given subject, since this, I believe, tends to trivialise what is expressed. There is a persistent sense in the reception of Shostakovich, however, that there is, as Valery Gergiev has put it, a hero in each symphony. Pauline Fairclough, who's written not only the best study of the Fourth Symphony, but probably the best study of any musical work that I can think of, Fairclough asserts that the presence of a symphonic protagonist, quote, is in a broad sense an undeniable feature of nearly all Shostakovich's music. Then she immediately adds, quote, though this instinctive premise seems secure, however, taking it further is fraught with ambiguities. End quote. Indeed it is. Stevens, in that poem, The Creations of Sound, writes of a human creator as a being of sound. From him, writes Stevens, we collect. Listeners may indeed collect from Shostakovich. In the case of the Fourth Symphony, what they ultimately collect is nothing. A gift of nothing. Will I manage as much here today? In the Fourth Symphony, and as in all Shostakovich's best work, nothing is quite what it seems, nor is there an essence to which the seeming might be opposed. It becomes necessary then to hear and to think seeming in terms of its own non-identity, instead of relating it to an absent essence. Irony here lies not in a disjunction between seeming and essence, but in the ways in which the music differs from itself. This immanent non-identity is made uncomfortably audible. Irony in Shostakovich must be delimited, since in his works there must be passages which are not ironic in any sense. At the same time, ironically, irony in Shostakovich cannot be delimited. Speaking of irony naturally leads us back to Mahler. There's a huge influence of Mahler on this symphony in particular. Size of orchestra, orchestration, sheer length, complexity, ambivalence of tone, incorporation of heterogeneous elements, shocking juxtapositions, and dialectical form. That's very important. Also the sense the symphony as a world, the symphony as inclusive rather than exclusive. In my musical introduction at the beginning, you heard the opening of the full symphony of Mahler with the sleigh bells combined with grace notes in the first flute, G to F sharp, giving the effect of a minor second. It's hard in those opening bars to get one's bearings, even when one can hear all the notes clearly. This is important for the beginning of Shostakovich's Fourth Symphony. Also, the beginning of Mahler's Sixth Symphony with this tremendous driving 4/4 beat in the bass, which is then, as it were, amputated at the beginning of the next movement, so that we get an accent off the beat, and it's now in 3. All these 3 movement beginnings, I think, are important for the beginning of Shostakovich's symphony. This is an excerpt from the book by Pauline Fairclough that I just mentioned. The symphony was written between 1935 and 1936, and these dates are important for a number of reasons. For one thing, of course, there was, in the middle of this process, the infamous Pravda editorial attacking Shostakovich explicitly. The premiere of the symphony had been planned for December 1936. It didn't happen for reasons that are not completely clear, but certainly had something to do with pressure from the Soviet administration. The first performance didn't happen until 1961. Shostakovich said to his friend Glickman on his belated premiere that in many respects he thought it was superior to his more recent symphonies. So I think it's time to actually hear the beginning of the symphony by Shostakovich, conducted by Kondrashek. This is another of those occasions where you should be blasted off your voices. That's the opening. And if we go back to the beginning of the score for a moment, then what we hear is a crashing minor second in the brass. It's quite a deafening effect if you're in a concert hall, or if you're so unlucky as to be playing at the back of the viola section. It's as if the orchestra is being turned into a factory, a becoming machine of the orchestra. Well, what more can we say about this? Because on the one hand, there is a four-square, heavy thesis that says that Soviet industrial power here is to be repeated and celebrated. But this is overlaid by a completely different thesis that says that Soviet industrial power is to be laid bare and criticised. And these two theses interfere with each other and even cancel each other out, generating what I would call a cognitive emotional dissonance. It's part cognitive, part emotional. There's a remark recorded in testimony about listening to praise of Stalin, which Shostakovich had to do a lot. He said to Volkov, allegedly, "It made my ears vomit." Extraordinary phrase. But I hear this so often in Shostakovich without being able to localize it in the oppositions between appearance and reality. As I've suggested, part of the difficulty in approaching Shostakovich is that nothing can be taken at face value and nothing can be taken on its own. It always has relation to something else. So I'm going to go on for a few seconds now in the next excerpt, picking it up immediately from where we just stopped, just to see what happens, because this is a massive and impressive opening using huge orchestral forces. And the question is, what happens next? Well, this is what happens next. Sorry, I couldn't find the right page there. But as you can hear, I hope, from that extract, there's something terribly anticlimactic about this. It's a kind of transition to subject A2, as Fairclough puts it. But there's a sense of nothing very much happening by comparison to the opening of the symphony. And the first movement is written in a kind of sonata form, so it's kind of important as to what happens first and what comes next and how you get from one to two, and this is by no means clear. It's my excuse for not finding the right page in the score. And what we get for much of the huge expanse of the first movement is a set of fragments and a sense of narrativity, but without narrative. Sometimes there are elements of almost cinematic montage in the way that the fragments are assembled. So what I'd like to try to do is to look at the end of the movement, immediately after the huge crescendo that I played earlier. This is going to be the next excerpt, again conducted by conjunction. So this is a much longer excerpt. It's about 6 minutes. Is that okay?
That's fine. Why don't you just see if that green plug is in?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Alas. So.
Excuse me, if I could be so bold as to suggest something, maybe we could play this from my computer, because I don't think the people in the last row are hearing anything right. So we're going to take a little technical pause here for a minute.
Okay.
And, I'm also just wondering, is it coming out of these computer speakers, or is it just coming?
I think so. It sounds like it's, yeah.
Yeah, let's just take another look at the volume here. Let's see, I don't think this was, now it's off. How do we get it? Did you have it like that?
I thought I did, but maybe I didn't.
Let's try it. Maybe you'd like to start from the beginning. Maybe you'd like to start from the beginning, so well, only is 30 seconds.
I'm not sure because there's more to come.
Okay.
But thank you. That's the beginning of the second movement. And what we heard is the end of the first movement, which has had commentators puzzling over it ever since it was first heard. And thanks to Cynthia, then most of it was actually heard.
At least I learned.
Thank you. Yeah. We have. At the beginning of the extract we have a moment of terror and suspension, but then a kind of collapse almost as soon as the recapitulation proper starts. It's recapitulation as capitulation. And then we have a beautiful cor anglais solo, and it's this passage which prompts that remark by Fairclough about the symphony having a protagonist. And there's something very human, I think, about responding to that and wanting to believe that there was a protagonist. For me, it's a question of a persona. I think the concept of persona is a very useful one in this context when you think etymologically it means a sounding through, a being of sound, as Stevens puts it. Then this is taken up by the violin in another solo, and then there's a bassoon solo, which I'm sure you noticed there, and that maybe sounded a bit familiar because this is actually picking up on theme A1, the thundering brass factory at the beginning. Only now it's been completely transformed. Its tone has been completely turned around, so that we're left, I would venture, not knowing which is the authentic version of this music. We heard at the beginning a parody of this bassoon solo, or vice versa. It's extremely unclear. And then in the coda, we have another solo by the cor anglais, but one that has a completely different character. There's a dramatic irony here, in the sense that there seems to be a player who knows less than the rest of the orchestra do, who carries on doing this ostinato in a relation of non-relation. In comic terms, we might imagine a player for whom the movement has been just too much and who's now lost count and who's repeating this two-note figure until the conductor puts a stop to it. In tragic terms, we might imagine an individual voice persisting despite the incongruity that is exposed in relation to the collective. There's also something mechanical about this repetitive figure in the cours anglais, echoing the becoming machine of the movement's opening, thus a post-human ending to the movement. Here I have a section about Adorno and negative dialectics, which I'm also going to skip as I did with Hegel. But negative dialectics in Adorno's sense is especially attentive to the remnants of positivity. Adorno didn't come up with the term positivity, it's fascism. Neither did I. It's Rasmus Willig, the Danish sociologist. But this is very much in the orbit of Adorno's study. Adorno attempts to listen to the sound that thought makes, which is just what I'm claiming is necessary to appreciate Shostakovich. I'm also going to skip the whole section about critics of Shostakovich and what one musicologist has called Shostaphobia. I wish I'd come up with that, but I didn't. We could maybe come back to that. It's quite funny what people say about Shostakovich. Sometimes even quite interesting. And I'm going to skip the much briefer second movement of the symphony, which is highly Mahlerian, referring to a movement in the second symphony of Mahler, the Resurrection. And I'm going to focus now, in fact, on the end of the whole thing. This is a highly arbitrary process, but it is simply impossible to give an overview of the third movement in particular, which is an extraordinary fact in itself, I think. So it's the same orchestra and conductor now taking us to the end of the symphony. And I might have to end there depending on how you're feeling. I've got more that comes after it, but let's see. So this is the final 7 minutes of the symphony, and I have to play it without a break, or its effects would be so lessened it wouldn't be worth playing it at all. And when we get to the passage in the score, I'll point this out. This that you see on the screen is the transition from the first coda to the second coda, which is kind of strange. I mean, how many symphonies have 2 codas at the end? It's as if one wasn't good enough. This is a crucial fact about it. those are some of the greatest pages that he wrote, in my opinion. One early critic said there's nothing left but to die. It's Mark Marando at the end. I think there's more to it than that, though. What we have is two codas here at the end of the symphony, in between which there is a negative dialectical relation. That is to say that they cannot be put together into synthesis. Firstly, the very loud, wonderfully loud passage that you heard at the beginning. The noise of the world, in C major, comes out of nothing, then it collapses, and after a very short transition, it's replaced by C minor, in perhaps the most dramatic collapse of this remarkably collapsing work. In terms that I take from Martin Heidegger, I think that this second coda is revealing an earth, difference from the world, revealing an earth that was already there, but that the world had covered up, such that the bass is made audible as bass. And I'm sure you can guess the extract I'm thinking of now, when the double basses start to have a syncopated rhythm. This is an allusion to this incredibly important passage. Conducting the Leningrad Philharmonic, which of course gave premieres of many of Shostakovich's symphonies. That's the end in Tchaikovsky. It's not quite the end in Shostakovich, because after that there's pedal point on C, which continues without the syncopation right until the end, and which, as Dorothea Redepenning puts it, creates the effect of a suspension of time. It's a song of the earth. It's no longer, I would say, the pathos of the human, as is the case in Tchaikovsky. It's as if we have the pathos of the human, but we also hear the post-human in the distance, in another dimension altogether. I could end here, or I could go on for 5 minutes to talk about a string quartet.
Oh, please, go on for
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay. Because The symphony I've been focusing on comes from the 1930s, and in that quote to Glickman, Shostakovich is giving us a sense that he had already achieved something which he was struggling to return to. So there isn't a clear narrative in terms of Shostakovich's development, and indeed when we get to the final period of his composing life, there are many connections with the Fourth Symphony and other works which he was writing back in the 1930s. I'd like to end with a couple of very brief excerpts from his final string quartet, which is from 1974. This is quite remarkable work which has puzzled both interpreters and musicologists since. This is how it starts. I'm going to stop it there, because this goes on for roughly 12 minutes, depending on the performance, which is quite remarkable. This was the Borodin string quartet that you heard. The only comparison that's occurred to me is with Samuel Beckett and his late prose, for example, Company, 1979. A voice comes to one in the dark, imagine. It's got a quasi-meditative, quasi-religious, quasi-liturgical quality to it. But this is not Shostakovich in his old age turning into Arvo Pärt, but rather, in fact, setting out to bore the audience to death. This is a remark that he made to the quartet that gave it its first performance. The audience who survives are, after 12 minutes, in a catatonic state. It's as if there is peace, but not for us. So we get an ironic sort of alienation, I think, from the beauty of the music. And then what I want to focus on is what happens next after those 12 minutes. So this is now going to be the end of the first movement. And it goes straight into the next movement, like this. it's very difficult to say anything at all for me after this. I think of what Adorno says about the form of the string quartet as being a kind of society, in the sense that what we see, or what we hear rather here, is a social breakdown. It's as if Pussy Riot were found to have been imminent to Russian Orthodox tradition all along, as if that was all waiting to happen during those 12 minutes. Again, there's no synthesis, I think, possible of all this. We get an ironic use of serialism, because that's actually a 12-tone row that is shrieked out by each instrument in turn. And then we get this remarkable figure on the cello. And I asked my students at one point what they made of this cello solo down here. One of them said it sounds as if it's played by someone who can't really play the cello, which I thought was a brilliant description, because there's a profound sense of alienation in this passage. It's as if the cello is searching for the aesthetic idea that is needed for reflective judgment. But the universal subjectivity on which Kant had depended has completely broken down. So now we have this kind of stammering effect. It's no longer even expressing the frustration of a subject, but rather merely expression as frustration, a frustrated searching for a concept under which to subsume the overwhelming sensory manifold, or perhaps just matter itself trying to say something. I'm thinking there of the famous exchange in Endgame, where Beckett's Ham says, "We're not beginning to mean something." And Floyd replies, "Mean something. You and I mean something." Oh, that's a good one. So there's another burst of serialism, and then the viola picks up the stammering figure again, which suggests that there is a kind of communication taking place after all. And then it's the beginning of the serenade, which is where we end it. And again, there's beauty, but not for us. The musicologist Richard Terushkin says about Shostakovich, it's never just Shostakovich, it's always Shostakovich and us, as he puts it. There's a very common slippage in music criticism, as with literature criticism, from the I to the we, to cover over the abyss of commonality that Kant had attempted to bridge. Shostakovich lays bare this abyss. His music takes place in the abyss between I and we. In this final quartet, he takes us to a non-place where it's no longer possible to speak of a composing subject taking us anywhere, or a listening subject being anywhere, giving us a gift of nothing. And with that, I've already said enough for today about Shostakovich and irony and me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we now have some time for comments and questions, and something tells me that you have something to say, right? Because we've heard about alienation quite a bit, and that's usually one of your...
Yes, well, I would like to come with a comment after saying that it was very inspirational to hear you. I work with things that are much related to it, and I liked your presentation very much. I don't know if you agree with me, but it strikes me that you very often talk about collapse and destruction,
Yes.
breakdown.
Yes.
that is not necessarily different from having a vital expression, because I think it's very vital. And I like the sort of the lineage you gave, where you had the Mahler thing first, his Fourth Symphony, and I think in particular with irony, and also the fraction he played from Shostakovich's first movement. I think the persona, I like the idea very much, would be related to a persona in the second movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony. I mean, I mean, this was very ironic to a sense. But whereas the irony with Mahler there is like reading Jane Austen, for instance. I mean, you have you sense that there's something beyond or beneath the appearance and knowledge of some kind, but it still accepts sort of the norms and the way things are in the world. Whereas with Shostakovich, I think it's perhaps more fair to say that you mentioned it could have an almost cinematic montage, and I immediately think of Lars von Trier, and Antichrist, where this fox says, "Chaos reigns." I mean, chaos is not a temporary breaking up of order. It is sort of the conditions that we live under. So all these dissonances and all these breaking up, and very interesting also that Lars von Trier uses after Antichrist, he uses the Tristan chord in Melancholia. So this lack of closure, this openness, that suggests that what our mind is able to grasp, because our mind wants closure. Adorno wants closure. He's a Marxist, so things should have a meaning. I think this leaving it to sort of a condition, and I think you said it very well, that there's something out there that has a beauty, but we can't really grasp it. Would you agree with that kind of?
Well, several things. First of all, thank you for listening so carefully to my rambling presentation. You picked up so many things. I've never thought about Mahler as like Jane Austen. I need some time to process that thought. I think that the characteristic irony in Mahler is different from Shostakovich. I think it's very hard to define what that difference is. If I'd had time, I would have gone into the second movement of the Shostakovich Fourth, which has a quite explicit relation to the brief scherzo movement in Mahler's second. And what several commentators have suggested is that it's highlighting the fact that in Shostakovich's Fourth Symphony there will be no resurrection. What I would add to that is that it's arguable that there is no resurrection in Mahler either, but that's maybe a separate discussion. On Adorno, what I'm basically trying to do here is to rescue Shostakovich from Adorno's patronizing, silly comments.
Yes, I get that, and I agree.
By means derived from Adorno. And I would disagree that for Adorno he's aiming at closure, because he says quite explicitly in Negative Dialectics, closure is death. Identity is death. Yes, he is a Marxist, but he's a very idiosyncratic kind of Marxist. And the approach in Negative Dialectics, which I was trying to draw on, is rather involving opening the system out into what it cannot accommodate, and insisting that it has a relation to it. But can I just add one more thing?
Yes, because if we can just maybe make a little pause here so we could get a comment from Bill, who's going to have to start his day in Texas in a minute. But if Bill, could we, let's see, can we hear you? One moment, let's see what's going on here. Yes.
So many intriguing ideas, and thank you for that. And the musical excerpts were great and so compelling. I just want to say that I think irony, I'm not sure I totally know all the points you're trying to make about what it does aesthetically, because it's very troublesome to me and confusing as a performer. And Shostakovich has always been a very confusing composer in my view. Compelling, and yet you don't know what he's up to, and that's intriguing. And it's also, when you're a performer, you have to put yourself on stage and decide what you're doing. It's hard, and so because my sense of performing is it's very hard to do it with integrity if you don't know what your own intentions are, and sometimes you can't tell. So for example, I know there's a famous thing where people said, I think it was Bernstein or somebody, some great conductor, said that everyone's conducting the Fifth Symphony wrong because there's a kind of a triumphal sounding march that isn't triumphal at all. It's ironic, and if you play it, you're missing the whole point if you play it a certain way. So there's a very good possibility that people end up feeling very foolish. So for example, the string quartet you played at the end, you could say that the 12th tone is being used ironically. Maybe it's not. You can say, then there's this beautiful melody that comes that seems very poignant. After all these fragmented things, there's this kind of beautiful cantilena, this beautiful melody. Maybe it's beautiful, maybe it's ironic, and I'm a fool to think that it's beautiful. So there's always this alienating possibility to be sort of, consider yourself a fool for having misconstrued it. And I think that's one of the big problems, as intriguing as it is. With Shostakovich, and he's sort of unique in this way. For example, he's not the only one who's expressed some of these ideas in music. For example, I think of Prokofiev, who could express grotesquerie and sarcasm and irony, but you're usually a lot clearer. For example, there's a piano piece which I've played a lot, and my student is playing it now, a set of pieces by Prokofiev called Sarcasms, plural, probably you know it. And that's great because we know exactly what we're up to. This is a piece about sarcasm. And then it's fantastic. You can explore it in all its dimensions. You can decide what your own narrative is about sarcasm. But, so these are the basic points I wanted that crossed my mind, a couple of them. One of them, just on a personal note, I grew up in New York City and then went to graduate school outside of the city, in a place where there are people from all over the country. And one of the things I discovered was that I developed a kind of a sarcastic, ironic way of talking, like almost all the time in New York, growing up in New York, that I thought was kind of sophisticated and cool. And it was a shock to me to find out what an alienating thing that was for other people. Like, they don't know if I'm kidding or not. And consequently, they felt on a wall. And so, I became personally very interested in the idea of irony and what it does in this communication between people. So I know that I'm rambling too, but you just brought up a whole lot of really interesting points.
Thank you. And again, there's so much there that I'd like to try to respond to. First of all, the sense of ironic coolness. I think that's very interesting, and that's one of the things that Hegel can't stand about irony. It just makes him mad. Schlegel, for example, has this ironic coolness about him, and it just drives Hegel crazy. And to an extent, I sympathise with that. And I think that in Shostakovich, we don't have that kind of irony that you just described, the ironic coolness. I don't see it. I think it's very, very difficult to describe what we do here. And I agree that irony is compelling, but also confusing and baffling. It was interesting, the example you gave, was it Bernstein?
I forget, I think it was him, but somebody said,
can you imagine?
We all start not getting it. It sounds like something, but it's really another, and we have to look different.
Exactly. This is the kind of thought that I was trying to criticise in earlier part of my paper, because I think that a lot of approaches to Shostakovich have sort of fallen over this problem of trying to decide what it really is. It must be really that, or it must be really that. A classical example, of course, is the finale to the Fifth Symphony. You know, we thought it was that, but now it's really this. And this is the kind of opposition that I'd like to try to get away from, at the cost of increasing confusion.
And my point, and this is the last thing I'm going to say before I go to my point is that people listening to it can decide, well, we don't have to decide, we can take it either way.
Yeah.
But I think a performer,
Yeah.
I think I have to say this, a performer does have to decide. Maybe there's some way to perform it without doing that, but I think it's very hard. And so you kind of have to figure out what it is you're up to if you're going to present it from the stage.
I agree up to a point, and I'm glad that you raised that practical aspect. There's an account of when the parts for this quartet arrived in the UK and were being studied by the Fitzwilliam String Quartet, gave it its first performance in the UK, and they were completely baffled. And that was one of the biggest problems, was exactly how do we play this? Not how do we play the notes, but what expression do we give it? What kind of tone should it have? And the reason I chose the Borodin here is because they maintain, in this first movement, which is incredibly difficult to play, they maintain this extremely ambivalent tone. That at one moment it sounds like a beautiful tone, at another moment it will sound like a dead tone. It's partly to do with control of vibrato, and they manage, for me, to keep it on that ambivalent edge pretty much throughout those 12 minutes, which many quartets don't do, because they just make it beautiful, because that's what musicians love to do. Of course, we love to make things beautiful. But I think the difficulty of playing a piece like this, or in the Fourth Symphony for that matter, on an industrial scale, is precisely not knowing the tone or the expression to give. Well, sometimes there are clear instructions in the score, but more often than not there aren't. And I think that makes Shostakovich particularly difficult to play.
Right. Well, I agree. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Can I come back to Mons, because you were saying something absolutely essential. In fact, you brought out the one thing that I would most like to emphasise to perhaps clear up any misunderstanding, which is when I'm focusing on collapse and negativity and so on, there is also a certain transvaluation of those processes going on, because I think very much, as you suggested, that there is something vital in collapse and weakness and incapacity and not being able to say quite what we mean, and so on and so on. And it's part of what I meant by being a leftover in relation to.
I did sense that was what you were saying, and I also think in connection with string quartet there. I mean, I dislike Adorno's idea about society collapsing. I mean, using that kind of metaphor there, because then you decide whether it's good or bad what's going on there. I mean, I'd rather think of it as perhaps just as silly metaphors I get, but something going on at quantum level. I mean, you don't, the causality, it's different conditions, and yet you recognize some structures that on the, in a bigger scale would be conventional. But when you're down looking at it, you can't really make out what are the rules for that. And I think that ambiguity and that openness is very appealing to me.
To me too, and also the fact that when you observe something, you are also participating in it and altering it.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a comment. The more, speaking of alienation, the more you were continuing further with your presentation and you were describing Shostakovich's work, including the holes you were talking about at the beginning, the frequent pauses that he made, and the alienation, this made me think more and more of Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, more exactly. The frequent pauses in the play, the alienation, and sometimes I remarked some playfulness in part of the symphony, and I think the more you were presenting, the more relations I found with Samuel Beckett, and I think it's very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, the whole concept. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm very pleased because I do personally associate the two figures, and I think there are a number of very strong similarities in working with music on the one hand and working with language on the other, and the very material way in which Beckett does that with words and also pauses, as you say, where it's very uncomfortable often for the audience to have to endure these pauses, because what's going to happen, and something terrible is going to happen, and why don't they just get on with it? So thank you for that. That's something I'd like to develop further.
Yeah, I have one small question. At some point you talked about post-human.
Yes.
Yeah. How did you mean that?
Well, there's a huge discourse now about the post-human, which I wasn't particularly thinking of. I meant it in a more sort of specific sense, such as to go back to the end of the Fourth Symphony. If we put that side by side with the end of Tchaikovsky's Sixth, then you could say about the Sixth that it is narrativizable in terms of the human. It's not the only way to take it, but it's possible. And there are elements of that in Shostakovich. It's not that he's just wiped the slate clean and is doing something completely new. His music indeed is saturated with references and allusions to past composers. But what I meant was that when we get to the second coda, the end of the movement, when the first coda, its noise in C major is over, it's as if a completely different dimension has suddenly opened up, and it's a dimension in which one can hardly even speak of alienation anymore, because for there to be alienation, there is implied a subject, for example, who's alienated, and this is like glimpsing not a world but an earth. I would say that is underlying the human world all along, but which we haven't heard, and now we get a glimpse of it in the distance, and that's what I meant by post-human.
Okay. That was very clarifying. Thank you.
Okay. I could also, time is getting on, but I had to leave out a lot about Kant as well, because I was trying at the end, as you might have guessed, to talk about Kant's critique of aesthetic judgment and the particular collapse that takes place in Shostakovich's last quartet in relation to that, which I think gives us a sense of the post-human in a specific way.
But it's kind of interesting that you say post-human. do you really mean sort of post-human, or do you just mean sort of non-human in the sense of being sort of a complement to the human? Post-human has sort of a chronology implied, and many of your remarks, at least the ones you just made responding to Johnny, don't seem to imply a chronology.
Yeah,
It's sort of a, almost, if you know, like the notion in set theory of a set and its complement. You know, it's just, it's the things that you take the human factor and factor it out, and then listen to it. Am I picking up on something
Yes,
there?
yes,
Okay.
you are. Yes, thank you. Because actually, thinking about what you said, it might be better for me to use the term inhuman. In fact, as Terushkin does. In fact, he's got a section in one of his books called Shostakovich and the Inhuman, because post-human does carry potentially the implication that this is a narrative, and something happened and now something else is happening, which follows on after it, and that's not what I mean.
But it's interesting, I mean, do you want to say inhuman or non-human? Because inhuman also has, at least as you know, in English, it's very loaded. I mean, the connotations...
It sounds pejorative, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's pejorative, and it's usually associated with things that are evil or...
Yeah, the 5-year plan is inhuman in that way. So maybe non-human.
Well, there is in the history of modernism and modernity this idea of depersonalization from Israel Pound and T.S. Eliot. And also in relation to irony and pathos, for instance, that you detach these qualities from being sort of a mode of the mind.
Yes.
And then you use irony and pathos sort of to present the subject and be totally detached. So you could talk about dehumanization, to some extent. If you take the consequence of depersonalization, say it's actually dehumanization that goes on.
But also, doesn't that have a... Now maybe it's just me, but that's dehumanization seems also to have this sort of negative...
Yes, it does. It does.
I mean,
It's difficult because, and it's very important to not to have the negative
and it's funny
application
because
to-
when you say depersonalized, I don't think it does that in the same way, but when you say dehumanized, that seems to have this sort of pejorative shimmer about it, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's also an interesting point that Pauline Fairclough develops in reference to early Russian formalism and the defamiliarization of the word.
Yes.
And she argues, I think, quite persuasively, that this is part of what Shostakovich is doing in the Fourth Symphony. And the title of her book, the main title is A Soviet Trader, which is a remarkable title. The first time I saw that, I did a double take, because I thought, surely that's the fifth, not the fourth. That's what I'd always assumed. But actually, there is good evidence that it must have come as a terrible shock to Shostakovich when the symphony had to be withdrawn, because it's quite possible that he thought he was writing a Soviet symphony, even a socialist realist symphony, because nobody knew what that meant, really.
And I think in connection with the Russian formalists, one of the ambitions of them was to sort of get people to discover the world anew, and to free the stone from all this stonish sort of prejudice, and so you could discover the world again. I think that is very much. I haven't listened that much to Shostakovich, but from listening from you, I can see it's again try to see this. I mean, to get away or beyond your habitual way of being in the world, and really discovering it again.
Absolutely. Yes.
And of course, the Soviet regime wouldn't stand that. Fine.
Can I shortly return to post-human, because I got some strange associations when I listened to this as Shostakovich. Would the word otherworldly suit this post-human thought of yours?
Yes, but then the otherworldly in Russia kind of belonged to the Orthodox Church. And then the otherworldly, of course, in Soviet ideology didn't belong anywhere because there was only this best of all possible worlds which had already been achieved. But still,
It's just to get the things straight in my head.
Despite what I've said, then there is an otherworldly quality about the end of the Fourth Symphony. Yes.
But again, if I picked up on what you were getting at, the kind of non-human aspect is still a rather imminent one. So it would be sort of misleading, I think, to talk about otherworldly, because I think what you're talking about is this world without always having a human overlay, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Oh, then we're in black metal theory.
Yes.
Ah, really?
Yes, Roy, you're going to have to start to attend these sessions
Fantastic.
regularly now. Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I must say, Johnny, that was an abrupt but fantastic segue. Transition, as they say, and the newscasters often have to make those when they go from one story to the other, which are completely, it would seem, unrelated. So I don't think there's anything else that can be said to follow that comment. So thank you so much. Really, it's been wonderful. I'm so happy to have you here, and we hope that you'll be a regular participant from now on.
Well, thank you all very much for your contributions. It's given me a lot to think about. Very, very helpful for me beginning this, to me, new path. Can I just play one more minute?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Just a minute, because...
Do you need to have the score up?
no,
Because
I don't.
Okay. But you have turned your volume up. Okay.
Yeah, I've been emphasising a lot of rather gloomy material today, but I wanted to end with the fact that the deeply serious in Shostakovich is very often overlaid by the deeply silly, and there's a lot of clowning in his music, and this is just my way of ending with a little clip with Shostakovich himself playing the end of his first piano concerto. So the recording quality is quite poor.
Very good.